In the frozen quiet of Pine Haven Valley, a woman lived alone with her memories and an old wooden cabin. That night, the blizzard roared like a living thing, tearing at her walls and her heart. Then, through the storm's howl, came a fragile cry, a sound too small to matter, yet impossible to ignore. She stepped into the white fury, unaware that saving those two tiny lives would begin a story of loss, love, and a miracle that would one day save her in return. Snow came in sideways across Pine Haven Valley, a white curtain swallowing fences, pines, and the narrow gravel road leading to Hannah Brooks's cabin. Inside, the old wood stove hummed low, its soft orange glow catching dust like slow-falling embers, pretending the world was still gentle if she didn't look too hard beyond the glass or remember. Hannah moved quietly through the cramped kitchen, her motions practiced, deliberate, almost ritual. Nights like this, she welcomed the storm's roar. It drowned out sirens that no longer wailed here. The crunch of metal, a boy's breath hitching once, then stopping. Let the wind scream, she thought. It could scream for her instead. A sudden thin sound slipped between gusts, not the low moan of pines or groan of ice on the roof sharper. Fragile, like fabric tearing underwater. Hannah froze, mug hovering in her hand. There it was again, a broken cry scraping along the siding. Too alive to be wind, too small to belong alone in a storm like this. She set the mug down and pulled on her heavy coat from the hook by the door, shoving bare feet into worn boots without socks. When she stepped into the white roar, the wind clawed at her face and stole her breath. The porch light blurred. Beyond its weak circle lay only shifting snow, crooked fence posts, suggestion of trees, doubt. The cry came again, fainter now, nearly swallowed whole. She followed it along the side of the cabin, flashlight beam jittering over drifts, stacked firewood, rusted tools hanging like ghosts of work that no longer mattered. The sound drew her to a collapsed cardboard box, half frozen to the ground, crushed against the back wall like trash. Inside lay two tiny shapes, soaked and shivering. Bobcat kittens. Their spotted fur clung in wet spikes, ears plastered down, eyes cloudy with exhaustion and ice. One lifted its head and tried to hiss, but only a broken wheeze scraped out. The other lay limp, sides barely moving at all, as if already halfway into surrender and dark. Hannah's chest clenched with something deeper than training. She swept them up, tucking both against her sweater under the coat, wrapping herself around their quaking bones. The limp one's head lolled, tongue slack. its silence loud against the storm. No answering call from a mother rose from the dark. The night had abandoned them. She kicked the door shut behind her and dropped to her knees by the stove. The kittens were terrifyingly light, skin and bone and ice. She grabbed a soft blue wool blanket from the couch. Edges frayed the same one that had once wrapped her son after summer baths, and spread it with hands that trembled from memory and the sudden risk. Her instincts returned in a rush, the ones forged in field tents and frantic corridors overseas. Warmth first. Always. She wrapped them snug, rubbed stiff paws, checked pale gums, watched for the smallest flinch. The stronger kitten thrashed weakly, claws snagging wool, refusing to let go. In her mind, a name surfaced. Ash. Stubborn fire. The smaller kitten sagged, breaths thin and slowing. That fragile chest stuttered, paused, refused to rise on time. Hannah leaned close, counting in a whisper the way she once had over another tiny body that never answered. Outside, the storm battered the walls. Inside, she heard again that terrible quiet that had broken her open. No. She breathed. The word cracking. Not this one. Not tonight. She pressed 2 fingers gently to the kitten's narrow ribs and gave measured puffs of air, careful not to crush what she meant to save. Over and over she breathed for it, murmuring please, stay, I'm sorry, to someone both in her hands and far beyond their reach. Time stretched thin and strange. Logic whispered to stop. Grief refused to listen. Then, under her fingertips, the faintest twitch responded. A shudder rolled through the kitten. It coughed. A fragile, wet protest, and its claws caught the blanket. A thin rasp of a cry slipped free, opening the room like the first pale seam of dawn. Tears blurred Hannah's vision as she eased both kittens nearer the stove and built the fire higher, feeding it like a fragile promise. Ash burrowed deeper into the wall. The tiny survivor nosed blindly toward her palm and stayed. Their breaths, uneven but real, braided into the air while the valley still screamed and shook outside. Inside the cabin, their fragile breathing stitched itself into the silence grief had ruled for years. Hannah rested her hand over the small rising shapes, feeling their hearts tap against her skin like new vows she had not planned to make. For the first time in a long Montana winter, the night did not feel like punishment at all. Morning came slow and pale over Pinehaven Valley. The storm spent, the world left muffled and new. Inside the cabin, embers glowed low, and two small bobcat kittens slept tangled in blue wool, their spotted sides rising with soft, stubborn breaths. Hannah woke stiff on the floor beside them, surprised to find she had slept at all. Ash stirred first, a faint growl rumbling from a body still too small to sound fierce. He blinked at the room, ears twitching, then climbed clumsily over the blanket as if claiming it. The other kitten, the one she had breathed back from the edge, lay quieter, pressed to Ash's warmth, as if listening for permission to stay alive. She touched the smaller one's back with one fingertip. It did not flinch away this time. Instead, a fragile shiver went through it, followed by a breath that seemed more certain. "You're still here," Hannah murmured, barely audible, voice rough from smoke and unslept years. The words were for them, but also, almost unwillingly, for herself. By mid-morning, a truck crunched up the icy drive, shattering the hush. Hannah scooped both kittens close as Eli Mason stepped onto the porch, stamping snow from his boot. He was broad-shouldered, lined with mountain winters and long patrols, his ranger badge catching a thin line of washed-out sun as he knocked on her door. When he saw the kittens on the blanket, Eli stopped just inside the threshold. Their tufted ears, faint spots and stubs of tails told him exactly what they were. He exhaled slowly. "Hannah," he said, half warning, half weary affection. "You know I'm supposed to report this. Bobcats are not strays you patch up and keep." Ash raised his head and met Eli's gaze with a fragile defiance, as if daring the man to argue his right to be here. The smaller kitten, pressed deep into the wall, only trembled. Hannah rested her hand over them both, an unconscious shield. "They wouldn't have made it another hour," she said. "No mother tracks, no blood, just a box and a storm." Eli crouched, studying them. The limp one's sides fluttered, still shallow. "This one," he said softly, "was gone." Hannah nodded once. Almost. Memories moved between them, the accident, the boy they had both watched them fail to save. Eli's jaw tightened. "We've got a rehab center in town. Licensed. Proper care. I can take them." Her fingers tightened in the blanket. The thought of these two vanishing into fluorescent light and metal cages twisted something raw. "They barely know this world," she answered. "All they have is this heat, this smell. You take that away now." She let the sentence fray. Ash dug his claws into her sleeve. Choosing his side, he hesitated longer than protocol allowed. Outside, the valley lay open and bright, as if nothing bad ever happened here. Inside, two wild hearts beat against Hannah's palm. Eli rubbed a hand over his face. If anyone else finds out, they'll come for them. And if they hurt someone, they'll come for you. This isn't mercy if it ends worse. Hannah looked down at the kittens, at the faint rise and fall she had fought for. I couldn't save my son, she said quietly, the words landing heavy between them, truer than any argument. But I saved them. Don't ask me to hand them over before they even understand they were chosen. Whisper a name just then twitched closer to her. Something in that small, instinctive lean made Eli's shoulders drop. He'd tracked enough wounded animals to recognize when a bond had already formed. You'll need guidance, he conceded. Formula, temperature, weaning. They're wild. Hannah. One day they'll remember it. He met her eyes. I can look the other way for a while. Not forever. Relief came not as joy, but as a loosening. Like a knot pulled one breath wider. I'll do it right, she said. Quiet. Careful. Ash yawned. Jaw tiny but full of promise. Then curled against Whisper. Their spotted coats touching. The fire popped. And for a moment the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like the center of some fragile vow. As Eli left, Clara Reed's curtains twitched in the neighboring house, her sharp eyes tracking the ranger truck, the glimpse of fur in Hannah's arms. Questions kindled where boredom had long settled. Back inside, unaware of the gaze on her, Hannah settled by the stove again, cradling the kittens as if steadying herself on their small, wild weight. The day thinned into a soft, winter blue dusk. Ash tested his paws, tiny steps along the edge of the blanket, while Whisper slept with his nose pressed into Hannah's wrist. Stealing warmth, she watched them breathe, feeling the storm's echo finally fade. In their quiet survival, the cabin's long-held sorrow shifted, just slightly, toward something new. Winter thinned into the pale light of March, and with it came a fragile rhythm Hannah hadn't known she missed. Mornings began with the kettle's hiss and two hungry mews. Ash would climb the worn chair to reach her lap before breakfast, while Whisper waited by the hearth, quieter, his golden eyes tracking every movement like a student learning the world. She'd learn their differences, the way Ash pushed into everything with reckless curiosity, while Whisper moved like smoke, thoughtful, patient. Ash chewed buttons, socks, and once the corner of a field guide Eli had left behind. Whisper would curl into Hannah's hand, a slow heartbeat steadying beneath the pads of her fingers. Two halves of a secret heartbeat. The names had come easy, as if they'd always been waiting. Whisper for the one who nearly faded away that night in the storm. Ash for the one who carried the fire. In saying their names out loud, the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a beginning. She spoke to them without realizing, filling the silence with a voice that no longer trembled. Eli stopped by with supplies, every few days bottles, syringes, powdered milk, advice she didn't ask for, but quietly followed. He watched the kittens tumble over each other on the rug, and something softer moved behind his guarded eyes. "They're growing fast," he said once, half warning. "Faster than you think." She only smiled. "That's what children do." One morning, Whisper refused his formula. His small body shook as he turned away from the bottle. Jaw slack, eyes unfocused. Panic returned like muscle memory. Hannah wrapped him in a towel, checking his pulse, his breathing, whispering his name as though it could keep him anchored. Ash paced nearby, tail flicking, a low whine threading the air. When the kitten's breathing faltered, Hannah didn't think she just acted. She bundled him into her coat and drove through slush toward the nearest clinic, tires sliding on the narrow road. The neon sign of Dr. Miles Grant. Veterinary care flickered like a prayer in fog. She burst inside, words tumbling. "He's cold. He won't wake up. Dr. Grant." Grey-bearded and calm, took the kitten gently, wrapping him in a heating pad. "You did right bringing him," he said, voice steady as winter stone. His practiced hands moved with quiet urgency. "It's dehydration, low sugar, nothing we can't fight." Hannah stood silent, hands trembling, watching another small body fight its way back to her. An hour later, Whisper stirred weakly. The faint rise of his chest drew tears she didn't notice until Grant handed her a tissue. "You've got a good heart," he said kindly. Then, glancing at her chart from an earlier visit, his tone softened. "But it's a tired one. You need to see the cardiologist in Missoula soon." She nodded without meeting his eyes. The drive home was long, the storm clouds gathering again over the ridge. Whisper lay warm against her chest, Ash dozing in the carrier beside him. Each breath from them seemed to echo her own heartbeat, uncertain but stubborn. In the rearview mirror, she caught her reflection pale, worn, and somehow alive in a way she hadn't been in years. That night, The fire burned low, casting shifting gold across fur and floorboards. Ash chased the flicker of shadows while Whisper nestled close to Hannah's knees. Small purrs breaking the quiet. The sound threaded through the room like music, fragile but whole. She reached down, tracing the line of his spine, whispering, "You don't give up easy. Do you, later?" She wrote the date in her notebook the day Whisper lived twice. She didn't call it a miracle, though maybe it was. Outside, snow began again, softer this time, drifting without urgency. Inside, the rhythm of breathing hers and theirs found a single, steady tempo, the cabin pulsing gently like a heart learning to trust itself again. Spring settled over Pinehaven in quiet shades of thaw streams loosening from ice. Pine sap sweet in the air, and the mountain light stretching longer each evening. In the cabin, Ash and Whisper had outgrown their nest of blankets. They prowled now, small shadows with widening eyes, discovering every corner of their borrowed world. Hannah watched them from her chair by the stove, heart caught between wonder and warning. Their spots had darkened, shoulders broader, paws heavier. Ash leapt onto the counter in a single bound, scattering the drying herbs she'd hung there. Whisper, slower, tested his strength against sunlight instead, rolling lazily across a square of warm wood. At first, their wildness was charming, a sign of health, of life returning. But soon came scratches on door frames, shredded curtains, feathers drifting from what used to be her pillow. When Ash hissed at his own reflection in the window, fur bristled. Hannah felt a chill that wasn't from the mountain air. Nature, it seemed, was coming back for what was hers. Eli noticed too when he stopped by with feed for her chickens. "They're not kittens anymore," he said, crouching near the hearth where Ash crouched, tail twitching. The bobcat's gaze was sharp now, less pet than predator. It's their instinct. Hannah, you can't teach them to forget it. She looked at him, then at Ash's twitching ear. Maybe they'll remember something else instead. The weeks turned restless. Ash began pacing at night, circling the door, ears pricking to distant cries in the valley. Whisper grew moody, keeping to shadows, eyes half-lidded but alert. One dawn, Hannah found her hands bleeding from an accidental swipe when Ash startled. He retreated immediately, confused, ashamed, but the sting lingered longer than the cut. By summer, word had travelled. Clara Reed's gossip had turned to whispers in town, and a letter from the Wildlife Bureau arrived in Hannah's mailbox an inspection notice. Polite but firm. She read it once, twice, feeling her throat close. "They'll take them," she said aloud, though only the bobcats listened. Ash tilted his head, as if already understanding. Eli came that evening, standing in the doorway like a man carrying bad news he didn't want to give. "You knew this would happen," he said softly. "They're too wild to keep, and too tame to release. You have to make a choice." She stared at the two creatures crouched near the hearth, her impossible children, and shook her head. "There's no choice that doesn't hurt." That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the floor beside them, running her fingers through soft, spotted fur while outside the wind hummed through pine needles. "You were never mine to keep," she whispered, "but you were what saved me." The fire dimmed, leaving their shapes outlined in amber light. The room heavy with what goodbye feels like before it's spoken. Before dawn, she packed a small bag, milk bottles, cloth, their favorite blanket. The forest road was empty except for the hush of birds waking. She carried them in the old crate, the same one they'd arrived in that storm. But now they pressed against it with strength she could barely hold. The path curved upward, toward the ridge where wild things still belonged. At the clearing near the old quarry, she opened the crate. Ash stepped out first, cautious, powerful, fur lifting to the scent of pine and dust. Whisper lingered, staring up at her with those gold-flecked eyes that had once stilled her own panic. "Go," she said, voice cracking. "Find your world." He pressed his head once against her wrist before following his brother into the trees. The forest swallowed them quietly. Hannah stood a long while, listening to the sound of branches moving, to the heartbeat she could no longer tell was theirs or her own. The wind smelled of rain. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint cry, not of pain, but of promise, fading with distance. Then only the hush of leaves remained. By the time she walked back down the ridge, the sky had turned the color of pewter, heavy with summer storm. Her arms felt empty in a way that was both unbearable and right. Back at the cabin, she left the door open a little longer than usual, as if expecting a sound, a paw step. When it didn't come, she closed it gently and let the quiet settle. That evening, the first drops of rain touched the roof. Soft as breath, Hannah sat by the stove, hands still raw from carrying the crate, her eyes on the empty blanket near the fire. Outside, the forest darkened, alive with unseen motion. Inside, she whispered their names, Ash and Whisper, like a prayer sent into wildness, trusting that love would find its way back someday. Summer bled into autumn, then winter again, and Pinehaven learned to hold its own silences. Without the sound of padded paws or small wild quarrels in the cabin, the rooms seemed larger, the fire a little louder. Hannah moved through the days with a practiced steadiness, setting 2 bowls by habit before remembering there was no one left to lap them clean. She filled the empty hours at the small vet clinic in town, helping Dr. Miles Grant wrap bandages, steady frightened dogs, calm aging cats who hissed at shadows. Her hands stayed busy in ways that felt familiar, stitching, soothing, measuring breaths, but each evening she drove back up the mountain road alone. The passenger seat holding only her worn canvas bag. The first winter without them was the hardest. Some nights she woke certain she'd heard a soft thump near the porch, a faint scrape of claws on wood. Once, stepping outside with a flashlight, all she found was her own breath clouding in the beam and the echo of a memory. 2 spotted shapes tumbling under a blue wool blanket by the stove. Saved from a storm that felt like another lifetime. Letters began one cold January evening, written at the kitchen table while the kettle hissed. "Dear Ash and Whisper," she wrote, ink slow. Today a hawk came low over the ridge. You would have watched him all morning. She folded the page and tucked it into a wooden box on the shelf, feeling slightly foolish and strangely comforted. By spring, the box had begun to fill. She told them about the fawn with the broken leg that healed straight, the stray collie that found a home with a widower down the road, the way the valley sounded when rain came without thunder. Each letter was a thread thrown into the wild, trusting invisible paws might follow it back. Her own body, however, betrayed what her voice hid. Dizzy spells came on soft as fog first, while lifting feed bags at the clinic. Then one afternoon, halfway up her porch steps, Miles checked her again, frowning at the printout. "Your heart's working too hard," he said gently. "You can't keep putting this off. You need proper treatment." She nodded, as if hearing a story about someone else. Eli noticed the change before she spoke of it. On long drives up to her cabin, he saw how her hands gripped the wheel tighter on curves, how she took the stairs slower. He found the letterbox by accident one day, flipping open the lid to see "For Ash" and "For Whisper" scrawled on folded pages. He closed it quietly, understanding more from that than any medical chart. The forest beyond her windows grew thicker, greener, as seasons circled. Sometimes, at dusk, she would sit on the porch and watch shadows pool between fir trunks, imagining two lean shapes slipping soundless through undergrowth. In those moments, the ache in her chest felt less like illness and more like a string tied gently to somewhere she could not see. 2 years after she'd carried them up to the ridge, a storm rolled through, all wind and distant growl. Hannah woke before dawn, restless. The air smelled like wet stone and pine pitch. She stepped out onto the porch with her mug, bare arms pricking in the chill, listening to the soft drip of last night's rain from the eaves. At the bottom step, pressed into the damp earth, lay a single print, then another, broad paws, deeper than a house cat, the pads wide, the claw marks faint where weight had shifted. Not cougar big, not dog, bobcat. The tracks led from the tree line to her porch, then turned back, vanishing into the thick grass as if swallowed by morning. She crouched carefully, fingers hovering just above the impressions, afraid to blur them. One print was slightly larger, one a touch narrower, paired the way they had always been side by side, daring the world together. The kettle whistled inside, unanswered. Out here, the only sound was her own unsteady breath and a thrumming hope she hadn't allowed in years. Hannah straightened slowly, one hand resting over her heart, feeling its uneven rhythm kick once. Hard, like surprise. Maybe it was coincidence. Another bobcat, another path. But as the sun broke over the ridge, catching on the wet tracks until they gleamed, she whispered their names into the cool air. And for the first time in a long while, believed someone out there might still be listening. The summer that followed came in hotter than Pinehaven remembered. Days stretched long and brittle. Pine needles turned dull. Grass went from green to tinder. In the high drawers above Hannah's cabin, lightning stitched silently between clouds, leaving the faint burnt scent of ozone and warning in the thin mountain air. In the evenings, Hannah moved slower, her breath catching sometimes on the porch steps. She hid the worst of it from Eli and Miles, tucking away the cardiologist's letters beneath her folded sweaters. When she tired, she sat with her hand over her chest, feeling the uneven drum, like a warning tapped politely on a locked door. Deep in the timberline, 2 young bobcats moved like shadows through the heat. Ash had grown into compact muscle and quick decisions, whisper into a longer, leaner grace. They hunted alone now, crossed ridges and creeks, but most nights their paths bent near the familiar valley, as if some invisible track still ran from their hearts to that blue-lit cabin. They knew the scent of her long before they saw her again, the trace of wood smoke. Wool? and the faint sweetness of the salve she once rubbed on cracked hands. On certain nights they paused at the tree line, watching the square of warm light in her window. Whisper's ears would tilt forward. Ash's tail would flick once, impatient, before they slipped back into cover. The fire came on a Sunday, born from a dry storm that dropped no rain. One strike in the high deadfall, one breath of wind, and the ridge above Pinehaven bloomed orange. By noon, smoke dragged across the sky in a low grey sheet. Sirens wailed down in town as crews rallied. Up the mountain, Hannah stepped outside, frowning at the thickening haze. She meant to leave early, to drive down before the road closed. But the stairs spun under her foot, a sharp pain grabbing her chest tight. The porch blurred. She caught the rail, then lost it, crumpling just inside the open door. The world narrowed to heat, smoke, and the heavy weight of air that wouldn't quite reach her lungs. Ash smelled it first the wrong fire, dry and furious, not the contained comfort of a cabin stove. From a rocky outcrop, he watched a column of smoke twist over the ridge toward the valley that had named him. Beside him, Whisper tasted the wind, catching under it the faint, remembered thread of Hannah's scent, now laced with ash and alarm. Without a sound, they moved, down through scrub and stone, bellies low, paws sure. They passed fleeing deer, circling hawks, the confused scatter of smaller lives. Heat pressed at their flanks as spot fires snapped in brush. But ahead, through the swelling smoke, lay the slope that led to the porch where a storm once opened into warmth. The cabin stood under a bruised sky, the air around it choked and ruddy. Inside, Hannah lay half-conscious, the room shimmering. Ash reached the steps first, hesitated only a heartbeat, then bounded through the doorway, tail lashing. Whisper followed, pupils blown wide, their bodies suddenly too big and too wild for this small, beloved space. Ash nudged her hand with his head, then her shoulder with more force. Whisper circled, coughing once at the smoke, then pressed his paws against her ribs, claws sheathed, insisting. A ragged sound left her throat as her eyes fluttered. Through the blur, she saw spots, tufted ears, those impossible gold flecks. Ash, she rasped, or dreamed she did. Whisper. They worked at her like they once had at the blanket as Kit's persistent, refusing her stillness. Ash tugged at her sleeve. Teeth careful, Whisper moved to the open door, looked back. then out, then back again. A clear command, inch by inch, with their nudging and her fading will. Hannah rolled, crawled, dragged herself toward the thin rectangle of bitter, life-saving air. Outside, embers drifted like frantic fireflies. The woods behind the cabin crackled, one tree torching into a pillar of flame. Ash led, slipping down the narrow path toward a rocky drainage he remembered from damp. Curious youth. Whisper stayed tight to Hannah's side, weaving against her legs, guiding each wavering step away from the advancing line of heat. By the time she stumbled into the shallow gully, her vision gone to grey at the edges, Ash was already there, pacing, urging her to lie low against the cool stone. She collapsed where he circled, Whisper pressing against her arm as if pinning her to the safest place left. Above them, the raw past branches giving way, flames running on, chasing higher fuel. When the firefighters found her hours later, soot-streaked and barely conscious, she was sheltered in the rocky fold, pulse weak but present. Near the lip of the gully, two sets of prints circled and vanished uphill broad. Familiar, burned sharp into the ash-soft earth. One rescuer glanced at them, puzzled. "Bobcats," he murmured. "Close, real close." Morning light leaked through the thin hospital curtains, soft and colourless, smelling of antiseptic instead of pine. Hannah lay still, chest bandaged in leads and tape, throat raw, eyelids heavy. The last clear picture in her mind was smoke, stone, and a spotted shape pushing against her, refusing to let her sink into the fire. Eli sat in the plastic chair at her bedside, a hat in his hands, ash still deep in the creases of his skin. The firefighter's report lay folded in his pocket, found in the drainage. Conscious enough to mumble, prints in the ash nearby. Bobcats. 2 of them. He'd read that line 3 times before the truth finally settled and would not move. When she stirred, it was to a dry whisper that barely crossed the space between them. Did anyone get them?" Eli leaned in. "Get who?" "Hannah?" Her eyes opened, pale but certain. "Ash." Whisper. They came back. No hesitation. No question. Just fact. Spoken like a name in a prayer she'd already heard answered. Later, when Dr. Miles Grant came to check her vitals, Eli handed him the report. Miles scanned it, brows lifting, bobcat tracks right up to her. He murmured, "Then gone upslope. He looked at Hannah. You were lucky. She met his gaze with a tired, wry softness. I wasn't alone. Neither man argued. Some debts didn't fit clinical language. News of the fire and her survival spread through Pine Haven faster than smoke had. At the diner, someone mentioned wildcats seen near her cabin for weeks before. At the feed store, Clara Reed surprised herself by insisting she always did have a touch with animals. The town stitched its own story, but all versions circled back to the same point. She should have died. When Hannah was strong enough, Eli drove her up past the blackened hills, oxygen tank hissing softly at her side. The cabin still stood, singed but standing, like an old soldier. Around it, the world was two colors, char and stubborn green. Shoots already needling up through cooled ash, as if the earth refused to stay broken. She walked only a few steps before her legs shook, but that was far enough. By the edge of the drainage where they'd found her, faint prints remained where soot had baked them in broad pores. Parallel paths, circling once before veering away. She lowered herself to a rock, fingertips hovering above the marks. You remembered, she whispered, voice thick. In the burned timber above, Ash watched her from a fallen trunk, muscles coiled, ears high. Beside him, Whisper crouched low, his gaze steady, reading the tilt of her shoulders, the way her breath came, measured but real. The scents were different now, char, medicine, new metal, but beneath them lingered the same warm thread that had once meant home. They did not go down. Wildness held them where they were. But as a gust of wind slipped through, Hannah felt it change, as if eyes behind the trees had blinked in slow recognition. For a heartbeat, the valley tightened into a single invisible line between woman and cats, stretched but unbroken, humming with everything they had traded and kept. Back in town, Miles watched her recovery with an odd mix of caution and awe. Most hearts don't handle that kind of insult, he told Eli in a quiet hallway. Stress, smoke, the climb. Something pulled her through. Eli just nodded toward the window, where the mountains rose dark and steady. She's not the only one with a stake in her. At home again, oxygen tubes trailing like pale vines. Hannah sat at the cleared kitchen table. The letterbox waited open. Instead of writing to Ash and Whisper this time, she laid her hand flat on the wood and spoke aloud, letting the words settle into the grain. Debt paid in full, she said softly. But I'm not done yet. Neither are you. As weeks passed, signs appeared with a kind of quiet mercy. A rabbit's remains left neatly at the tree line, not torn in panic, but placed. Fresh tracks looping closer on mornings when her porch light burned late. A fleeting shape at dusk, just beyond focus, tail tip flicking once before the underbrush swallowed it with deliberate calm. The fear that had once wrapped her life like barbed wire eased into something else: responsibility, maybe, or invitation. The fire had drawn lines on the land, but also revealed how many eyes watched, how many paws and wings lived on the edge of human noise. Hannah looked at the scarred hills and felt an idea take root, small but insistent. One evening, as the sky went lavender over the ridges, she stood at her doorway with a mug of tea and the weight of a decision finally formed. "If you're going to keep circling this place," she said quietly into the trees, "we might as well make it worth the trip for more than just us." Somewhere up the slope, two wild hearts listened. By the time the next spring settled in for good, green threaded through the burn scar. Soft and stubborn, Hannah's cabin, once a place she hid from the world, had become something else: maps on the wall, notes on the table, a bulletin board in town calling it what folks had started to whisper anyway: Pine Haven Wildlife Refuge. The idea had come simple and quiet. If wild things kept circling her life, she could at least make their landings softer. With Eli's help, she fenced off a slope below the cabin, not to cage, but to shield. Old beams became sheltered platforms. Wind-fallen branches stacked into brush piles for foxes, owls, whatever needed a place to catch its breath. Dr. Miles drove up twice a week now, a cooler of supplies in the back of his truck. They treated burned paws, tangled wings, the casualties of carelessness and weather. Call it outpatient for the wild, he joked once. But there was reverence in the way he placed a bandaged hawk where it could see sky, as if knowing whose story paved this change. Word spread the way good rumours do. School buses came slow up the mountain road, carrying kids who walked softer once they stepped onto the property. Veterans from the clinic followed, shoulders tight, eyes scanning, then easing when they saw how Hannah spoke not about miracles, but about second chances that wore fur and feather and did not judge. She told her story less dramatically than others, repeated it. No talk of destiny, no gilded edges, just the storm, the box, the kittens she named, the day she let them go, and the night fire wrapped the ridge and they came back through smoke. In her telling, the wonder was not that bobcats had remembered, but that she had chosen to. Behind the rehab pens and quiet paths, the tree line watched. Ash, broader now, moved with a measured confidence along the ridge, his silhouette cutting clean against dawn. Whisper stayed closer to Shadow, slipping between rocks, listening. They no longer needed walls. Their territory was written in scent, in memory, in the unbroken line back to her. Sometimes at dusk, a young bobcat shape appeared at the far edge of the clearing lean, unsure, wearing the same flecks of pattern Hannah had traced years ago. Ash would sit just inside the brush while Whisper hovered behind, letting the youngster stare down toward the cabin light to learn. Wild, yes, but wild threaded with a story. On a cool June evening, Hannah stood before a small circle of children and old men and women, the air smelling of pine and rain-soaked soil. She held up one of the letters she once wrote to the kittens and smiled. "I thought I was saving them," she said. "Turns out they were putting away something for me, for a day I hadn't seen coming." Eli watched from the back, arms folded, the lines at his eyes deeper but easier. He'd seen her nearly die, then choose not just to live, but to build. She doesn't know when to quit, Miles muttered beside him, though there was pride in it. Beyond them, a pair of gold eyes flashed once between branches, then settled, unafraid. When the crowd thinned, Hannah walked alone to the edge of the trees, the evening humming low. She set a bowl of fresh water on the old stump out of habit, though she no longer pretended the gifts were for house cats. "For whoever's passing through," she said softly, "and for the two who never really left." Leaves stirred without breeze. From the darkness, Ash emerged halfway, enough for the light to catch the familiar scatter of spots along his shoulder. Whisper remained deeper in shadow, his gaze steady, unreadable and kind. They did not approach, did not need to. Recognition moved between them like a shared breath that crossed no distance at all. Hannah's hand went to her chest, not in pain now, but in quiet accounting. Fire, storm, tracks in ash, prints by her door, all of it weaving into one simple truth she could finally say without breaking. "You're safe," she whispered. "I am too." The bobcats held their ground. Centuries of a promise no one else had the language to record. As darkness folded over Pine Haven, cabin light glowed warm against the slope. A small, steady lantern. In the trees, wild paws turned back into the night, carrying their bloodlines and their memory up the ridge. The woman they once fit in a blanket watched them go, knowing they had already given her back more than she'd ever given away. Long after the last car left and the porch light dimmed, Her words lingered over the valley, carried on cool air through pine and stone and quiet fir. Sometimes, when hearts are broken open wide enough, they make room for unlikely covenant. Sometimes, what we save does not just survive. Sometimes, what we save saves us back. If this story touched your heart, just drop a 1 in the comments, or a 0 if it stayed quiet inside you. Don't forget to subscribe. There are more gentle stories waiting just beyond the trees.